My name is Guobin Yang. I teach here at the Annenberg School and Department of Sociology. I will very briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll have the presentations and leave some time for discussion. A slight change of order. First one will still be Christine Onsworth from Drexel University, and Rebecca will be speaking last, and Christopher, you'll be speaking second. Actually, I'm not going to, I don't need to reintroduce them actually, because we have a pretty long bow at the end. I'll say very briefly, Christine is an assistant professor in the College of Information Science and Technology at Drexel. And her research areas cover information policy, government information, and ethics. And that is the.
That's the original.
That's the original title, which I can't read.
Yeah. Translation in the title that's listed.
All right. So, Christine.
Thank you. Yes. So, Wir müssen alles wissen is what on the title, if you have the agenda, is we must know everything. And I thought this was a really apt quote to start with. Are you going to give me? I'm a pacer. I'm sorry. Get dizzy. Well, since it's after lunch, I was thinking if I move a little bit, it will help people, stay focused. In any case, wir müssen alles wissen. Erich Mielke was the head of the East German State Security, or Office of State, Ministry of State Security, for most of its existence during the East German Democratic Republic. At one point, and I forget the exact date of this, he stated that we have to know everything about everybody and nothing can slip by us. And this was kind of the motto of the state security apparatus of the GDR. And I thought it was apt when we think about the ability that we do have and think about the things that we share on social media, the conversations we start, and the potential all of these have to be pieces of intelligence for police or government agencies. So what I'm going to do here, and I was looking for a few slides, a few images for this presentation, and oddly enough, I came across a presentation I did back in 2008, and the title of the presentation was "Someone to Watch Over You: Surveillance and the Cost of Security." And what I did was I looked at the East German national security apparatus and what was going on in the United States post 9/11. And I was thinking, and I asked students, this was a lecture for students, I asked them ultimately if it really matters. The government officials scan your email, analyze phone records, or even subpoena library transactions. Do we really care? Do we have something that we care about? Is so much information being gathered that we're going to be able to hide within the bulk of data? And so little has changed in these 5 years, right? Except that we know more about the NSA program for gathering information. I'm going to try and multitask as well. I went the wrong way. That's not a good sign. Okay, so I kind of see we're looking at, and this also goes along with my own research, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So we're constantly dealing with these things. We're dealing with conceptions of trust and the potential of betrayal. We're dealing with whether to share information or whether to keep it secret. And we're also dealing with the state and privacy. I think we all deal with these all the time in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives and in our interaction with the state. So as social scientists, we like to watch. That's what we do. We like to gather data about what people are doing, why they're doing it, try and understand their movements, their discourse, what's going on behind that. We are in this attempt to make sense of the world around us, right? And so as everybody has already discussed this morning, you know, we have safeguards, we have IRBs, we're cognizant, I would say, of the concerns about watching and publishing certain amounts of data. We are concerned about what's public versus what's private. We think about that in our research. But social media does cloud this distinction. It makes it a bit more difficult. How do we maintain our ethical standards in an era where some decry that privacy is a thing of the past? I can go ahead and, the dean of our college loves to come up to me and tell me that privacy is dead. And so we always have this conversation, and I finally say that may be true, but ethics are alive and more important than ever. So how do we negotiate these things, right? We try and anonymize our data, yet we still want to provide a true representation of what was said and by whom. We want to be authentic, as well as we want to protect the people that we are researching. So what I want to talk about for the next 15 minutes to start with is the kind of trope that we have for surveillance today, some of them, okay? So when we talk about these subjects, and it's in the media all over the place, you initially hear, oh, it's Big Brother. We're living in a state of, George Orwell was right, 1984 has come into existence. This is the case, right? The other instance we get is, oh, it's just like, you know, this NSA surveillance is, we can draw an analogy to the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, same kind of thing. It's just, okay, it's digital, but still, it's this massive surveillance that is you know, going on in society, and we need to be concerned about this. We need to do something about it. There are important differences, though. And even though I'm bringing these up and making them very much to the fore, there is a difference between an authoritarian regime. As Katie talked about earlier, there are different aspects of what's happening and how we're dealing with the data, the stakes to some degree. And I don't think that those things are looked at as closely, the differences. It's much easier to just say, oh, it's like this, raise one's hands, and what are we going to do about it? And then no presentation on this topic would be complete without, you know, referring to the panopticon and Foucault. So all of these things are kind of like how we're dealing with the massive amounts of data that we have access to and the massive amounts of data that we share. But one thing that they don't really bring up and don't like throw in our face, that's kind of simmering underground or underneath the surface, particularly in the US post 9/11, is this aspect, which is very, very, I think, let me see, my dissertation work was on the See Something, Say Something campaign. That was in 2010. And there was still a fair amount of, people were talking about it, and there was discomfort with it. I think this has probably become a pretty much normal thing. I don't think a lot of people care about it anymore, per se. They're like, oh yeah, that looks suspicious, I'm going to report on it. But when you think about this in our lives and the way we interact with social media, the way we as researchers look at tweets or different research corpi, do we say something? Are we obligated to say something if we see something in our data? And some of you have talked to this, and it's a really difficult situation that we're grappling with. So we have, we had Big Brother, I have some images from the Stasi, and then we've got this image, which I actually had never seen this one before, the NSA surveillance octopus. Okay, so this is kind of an image of, I don't know if this is the most current image of kind of the way that the NSA is gathering data from the different hubs. There's a great link I could go to, or I could put up later if you want to see it, from the Washington Post that just shows the different levels of surveillance that has been instituted in the US since 9/11. And so this is really confusing when you're working both. I understand what Hector was talking about, using both mouses. So as we've been talking about, when we are doing this data, when we're looking at this stuff, what kind of harm is there in in mining this kind of data and using this kind of data? If we're willingly sharing information, should the public, should anyone care if it's being used and gathered? And can we have an expectation of privacy? So a little background on this. I have started doing some work with law enforcement, a group that I never expected that I would be working closely with. And so I was in Dallas in July, and been in Oakland, and I know officers from all over the world who are attempting to use social media for a dual purpose. On the one hand, as individuals, and in some cases organizations, they're hoping to use social media as a tool to bring the community closer to them, as a tool to provide information, hopefully as a tool for the community to provide them with information. So if there's, if there is some way that they can offer an anonymous tip line via social media or whatever, all sorts of different things. But on the other hand, they're using this constantly as a tool of intelligence gathering. And so how do you engage a community to work with you, or even be willing to speak to you when there's this underlying potential of misuse of information or betrayal to the strongest degree? So when we think about the amount of information and the depth of things that we can look at, this is another image from the Stasi. How many of you are familiar with the story of January 1990, when these things happened? One. Okay, so just a quick background. So these bags are all full of, for the most part, ripped up dossiers, personal files that were gathered by informers to the Stasi, to the East German secret police. In January of 1990, the wall is down, things are still kind of shifting around, and some people noticed that there was smoke coming from these offices, and the old state security offices, and they stormed them, occupied the offices, because these were their personal files. These were the dossiers of people in the community, and one of the big rallying cries around this was, we want access to those files. Those files ultimately belong to us. And so when you think about that, and I'm stretching your imagination to technology, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, things that some of us may use, but many of us do research on, you can kind of think about just the comparison and the massive amount of data. So here's one of the bags opened. There was an interview not long ago in, I think it was on the BBC. An archivist at the archives, the Stasi archives, said that would take something like their current number of archivists 400 years to put all of the data back together. So I like this because this is a very physical image of personal data, of information that we may be sharing. And the thing that I find that makes it even more powerful is that in this apparatus, a large part of the informing group they were unofficial informers. So these weren't people who were part of the apparatus per se. They were citizens that the ministry had, through different means, convinced that they needed to spy on other people. And so you would have what came out in the 90s was discovered. You have parents who were reporting on children, vice versa, husbands, wives, best friends reporting on each other. And so much like some of the mundane stuff that we may share on Twitter, you know, I tweeted that I was here and it's a great event. All of these little mundane things were being reported back and were being kept in these sort of files. Things that you wouldn't think mattered at all, right? But when you go and you read some of these, a friend did let me look at her file, and it's some of it is ridiculous, you know, that she went to the store and she did this or that. But they had power, and they had an immense amount of power in some people's lives. So this is an identification card that was used. So you have all the documents. The documents. Those were all gathered by usually the informal worker. And so you have one person that's going out and being your best friend. We're out having a drink. I go back the next day. I'm called in to report to my supervisor what you said to me. And so this is the ID card that was used. So that in this card we can see that the Mitarbeiterrote is the actual person working for the ministry. We can see that Dieter Nowatzki was the actual informer who went under the name Antenna. And you can see what part of the organization he was working in. This is all metadata. So when you think about bringing it back now to things that we're being told that, oh, don't worry, we're just collecting metadata. Metadata tells us a lot of stuff. It tells us a history, and we have a history that's saved more and more in metadata. So this is a great image I found online showing, and I don't know that you can see it. They actually have little pictures of the people that are involved with these nodes. This is also metadata, but it's certainly more than that. We can certainly see individuals and see what's happening. So I keep doing the same one. This brings me to something that I'm not sure. Is there a way that I can run this link? Where's the? Oh, it's down here. Okay, sorry. Okay, so as I told you that I've been doing some work. No, it just went to the next slide. Yeah, okay. Anyway, thank you. So what I'm going to show you is an example of this kind of information being used. It's not text information, it's not Twitter information or Facebook information, but it's actual CCTV footage that was viewed after the Vancouver riots in 2011. You can just run it, okay? And as I finish up, I just am going to let this run. So this was 2 years ago. The Vancouver Police Department had all of this, way more than this. They've apprehended tons of individuals. And so this is still on their website. And there's a form. If you click one of these, it goes to a form that you can fill out the name of the person, how you know the person, their address, all sorts of contact information. And I'm not saying that we are living in some authoritarian regime, that we most certainly are not. We can't make that comparison. But we certainly are all being encouraged and involved in this, what we call lateral surveillance. This, you see something, say something to me, and so on. We're all kind of looking out and looking after each other in not necessarily a good way. So I don't know how much longer they will, continue running this site. I think it's an interesting thing to look at, however. So, in any case, I, like everyone else, am leaving you with more questions. I don't know the ethics of this kind of stuff. You know, I'm writing about what how Vancouver Police Department is using surveillance technology and social media technology to deal with events. But how do we understand, what can we say about this? You know, what can we say about the fact that, you know, who knows, maybe this kid was just kind of hanging out, you know, teenagers like to just be where it's lively, but perhaps the person was, you know, involved in, you know, something much worse, and we need, you know, to catch the bad guys, as was talked about earlier, right? What if we need somehow to catch these people? How do we stand as academics who are interested in these kind of events and interested in this really difficult balancing act between power structures, security, and privacy and civil liberty? How can we start really looking at this? Because the information is being used. It's naive to think that law enforcement or any other government agency isn't looking at this data all the time. So just to add one more turn to our conversation from today, and I'll close there.
So we're going to move on to the second presentation and leave the questions and discussion to the end. And our second speaker is Christopher Wilson, who is a knowledge lead for the Engine Room. I'm sure Chris will tell us a little more about the Engine Room, an organization that provides direct support to advocate using technology and conducts applied research on the same. Chris also manages the Engine Room's Responsible Data Program. So thank you very much, Chris.
Hello, my name is Christopher Wilson, and I'm jet-lagged on the panel after lunch, so I'm also going to pace quite a bit. I am here from outside academia. I work for a small NGO that, among other things, does applied research to try and improve program design. So that has a couple of consequences. One is that I might, if I devolve into jargon, NGO jargon, please don't hesitate to stop me. The same if I speak too fast. I tend to do that. Secondly, I raise a lot of issues in my presentation as I put it together that I assumed would be referenced here and solved. I figured there were a lot of things that you would all have all the answers to already. I see now that's not the case. So there's lots of things I'll be referencing that I'd love to have more focused conversations about and to talk about the advocacy experiences that can be relevant. So I'm going to start off with context, and though I realize it's trite to reference the printing press, I would argue that we are in the middle of a digital boom, a structural societal shift of sorts, and that we're all in this room for one reason or another because we're interested in the consequences of digital innovation and digital technology development has had for social structures. And part of that digital boom, as we see it, is that we're looking less and less at political power relationships in these kinds of terms and more in these kinds of terms. And the same is largely true for advocacy. I think we see a lot less of advocacy that looks like this in the streets and a lot more focus on advocacy that looks like this. And not just Ushahidi, but all kinds of digitally and mobile mediated advocacy and information advocacy, whether it's through surveys or citizen reporting or what have you. I would argue that we're still just seeing the slow and ever-expanding scope of the peak of inflated informations, but this is very much a hype cycle now. But interestingly, it's a hype cycle that's reinforced by the wide proliferation and the facilitation function of technology. Not coincidentally, the advocacy initiatives and the projects that tend to use technology and information also tend to be quite good about talking about what they do online, which gets them international attention, which is again very visible to people in country. And you have this kind of self-referential cycle whereby technology and the hype around technology tend to reinforce themselves. One consequence that has is it's created a kind of a sub-community within advocacy circles of advocacy that's focused on information. And we get buzzwords like evidence-based policy, data-driven campaigning, research, communication, and uptake. And this is a good thing in many ways because it moves us a little bit beyond tech fetishism. But what we haven't really done yet to the degree that we need to is think carefully about what these data are, what kind of information is being used, and how it does or does not conform to our 20th century informational hygiene. Because there's a tremendous amount of data being produced by civil society right now. There's so much that the United Nations high-level panel on 2015 goals, if that means anything to you, even they are talking about civil society's data revolution. And if you can get shirts as stuffed as that to talk about it, then something must be going on. And thinking about what kinds of data, I think it's worth thinking both about data that is collected and data that's generated unintentionally. In terms of collected data, we're talking about surveys, which are so cheap and so easy. We're talking about citizen reporting mechanisms, online portals for consultation. We're talking about the collection of information about individuals for campaigning purposes. And then in terms of generated data, we're talking about information that is generated through normal activities, but especially through web and digitally and mobile mediated communication. And the thing is that this process leads to a lot of great tools, and there's every implication that these tools are very useful and productive, but things can also go wrong. So I just want to give a couple of very quick exemplative harm stories about the types of things that can go wrong in the advocacy context when you're relying on this much information. This is an example of a HIV medicine mHealth initiative that was pushing reminders to people on their mobile phones regarding their medication. And they had the bright idea that they should take this data that they had collected on their user base and integrate it into a social media campaign that targeted people on their Facebook accounts. Another great example of something that was fortunately not funded, these are funder examples, was a project to do video interviews with rape survivors before they receive their treatment in the clinic, and to gather this selection of interviews and to make it, to release it as evidence for changing policy. Also not funded, but for program design, important considerations. There's also bad data collection out there. This quote and this picture are from a Harvard research project in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. And I think it well represents the kind of animosity that we don't want to engender by not turning our data back around and making it useful to the people we collect it from, the feelings of exploitation. There's also concerns around how data can be reused. This is from the gun map, which many of you probably know better as an example than I do here in the States. In the beginning of the year, after school shootings, a local paper released, I think it was over 30,000 homes and addresses of gun owners in New York City. A very powerful advocacy tool, but it then led to death threats, to burglaries, retaliatory maps whereby they posted the addresses and information of people who worked for the newspaper. Raises lots of really interesting ethical issues about how open data can be used. Data security and data storage. There's examples of oppressive regimes breaking into civil society headquarters and stealing USB pins that has all the contact information for members and people who have been receiving legal aid. There's the example of the infamous digital security training that went into an oppressive Middle Eastern state, trained a half a dozen activists, and then gathered all their contact details and their names, put it on a memory stick, which was then confiscated by state security as they left the country. There's perhaps the most notorious example of in Sudan. Shortly after the Tunisian and the Egyptian protests, they were inspired to organize a protest on Facebook as well. But it didn't take long until that led to arrest, detention, torture. It's a dangerous like. These are all examples that are illustrative in one way or another, but they're all also anecdotes, because the problem is that we don't really know how things go wrong. We just know that things often can go wrong with the best of intentions. We're trying to, part of our work is to try and figure out exactly how they go wrong and where the opportunities to prevent harm takes place. And we are thinking about this in terms of a challenge for advocacy generally. And we'd say that it's problematic because not only can the best intentions lead to harm, But it's especially problematic right now for data-driven advocacy, because data-driven advocacy is in something of a growth spurt. It's kind of like it's in puberty. There's hormones all over the place, and new things are being tested and tried out, and testing the limits all the time. And so we don't really know what's going to happen next. But at the same time, we have no incentives to talk about when things go wrong. The organization who had its membership data stolen by state security offices, they don't want to tell their funders about that. That's not something they want to announce in the international conference circuit when they are making appeals for support. And they certainly don't want to talk about it openly locally. That does nothing but damage engagement. So the problem is, when we have this much data being used, this much potential for harm, and so little incentives to talk about it, how do we better understand when we can mitigate that harm? So we are doing a lot of talking with activists to try and figure that out. And we have a feeling that there's at least three main areas. There's issues of consent, and informed consent is hugely problematic in the first place, but especially for advocacy, there's a very, very fundamental tension between engaging communities and telling them about all the things that can go wrong if they talk to you. There's also a problem of function creep. How do you anticipate how data can be used 20 years from now? If you're collecting personal information during a disaster, for example, that's very useful, but how is that used when the disaster is over and the context is completely changed? Issues of identification. We've talked about this a lot. Privacy, but also the Mosaic effect. How does theoretically anonymized information get combined with other data sets to identify individuals? How do you anticipate that kind of risk? And agency. This is closely linked to issues of participatory research, participatory action design. The term of art that I've recently stumbled across is informational self-determination. And this has a close kinship to many developmental principles and principles that we've talked about here today, but so far I don't think we have a way to operationalize it. The one thing that's missing here that I wish I had added after hearing some of the conversation today are community effects and social systemic effects. What happens to marginalized populations as populations when research and analysis put them in the spotlight, whether it is gay men being targeted by other advocacy groups, or whether it is marginalized communities whose presence is made known to authority and that results in discrimination. That's also something we see. So we're looking to the academy now, because you have this fantastic tradition of ethical review, probably something to learn there, and because, as we heard earlier, it's a new medium moment, so maybe there's a chance to get something out of that. Needs and resources, and parents in the room might recognize Little Miss Helpful, helping us out to map this. So what can we learn from the advocacy context? I'd argue that there's at least two things worth looking closer at. There's the close engagement with communities, and there is the heightened risks involved in human rights work. I think there's a hugely underexploited opportunity to collaborate between the academy and civil society organizations, and to bring the voices of the communities that are being studied into the design process, something approximating user-centric design, which would arguably not only cover the ethical back, but also produce better data. Also, the heightened privacy and security risks which often surround human rights work, ironically, they offer a kind of excellent environment for really trying to understand what best practices can be for engagement. What to get from the academy. Advocacy can learn a lot from the IRB process, both what to do and what not to do, I would expect, especially the tiered structure and how to understand when IRB is relevant. There's so many checklists and templates and small resources that we want to see hacked and adapted to the advocacy context. There's criteria for when not to engage in an ethical review. That's hugely important, because the last thing we want to do is bog down every advocacy initiative with the need for review. There's opportunities to parachute in expertise, to find individual academics who can help in-country partnerships to design and implement evidence projects. And there's all those articles and guidelines and think pieces out there. There's a tremendous amount. How do we make that useful and relevant? We started mapping them. There's a link there. We'd love it if you wanted to contribute. Even better if you already have a list that is in a structured data format that we can just kind of pump in. But the thing is, even once we start identifying what all these resources are, they need to be adapted to the advocacy context. They need to be made understandable. It's obvious to anyone outside the academy why, when I first mentioned this to most academics that were looking for help from the ethical review process, they say, oh, but you're not really doing research. Don't worry, you don't have to. That's the first response, because it's perceived as onerous. So we need to make it useful, we need to make it intelligible, and we need to make it quick and productive, whatever resources we find. Which brings me to the pitch. We have a responsible data program, which is going to be up and running from next year. There's a diagnostic component where we're conducting interviews with people on the ground and with people providing support. We're going to be building a lot of resources. We're going to be trying to pilot some kind of model for ethical review, and we could use input on that. And we're going to be doing mentorships and documentation of the process that civil society goes through to open up their data and release it. If anybody's interested in advising on this project or giving other kind of input, that's very welcome. If you'd like something less, with less commitment but more specific, you can also help us identify resources. There's lots out there. You can advise us on the ethics and methods of individual projects in an ad hoc way. Oh, well, that didn't come through. Well, I have paper versions of this. You can help us build. In March, we are going to be gathering about 70 people, and we'd like for there to be at least a handful of academics there to help us build small tools. And we're thinking about things like checklists for things you need to consider before you're setting up an SMS reporting platform, or principles for using an app to collect information on your members. Things like this. Very small, agile, highly modular resources that people in the field can pick up and use it to explore further. And so if you'd like to join us for that, I have more information on that. And that's the end of my pitch, I think, which makes the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And our final speaker is Rebecca McKinley, who is an old friend to many of us here. Rebecca has done all kinds of work, so it's impossible to mention them. I'll just mention a few things. One is that she has a wonderful book titled Consent of the Networked, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. She's the co-founder of the citizen media network Global Voices Online, which has been a great resource for activists, for researchers and teachers. And she's on the board of directors of the Global Network Initiative and the Committee to Protect Journalists. And she's currently also affiliated with our Center for Global Communications Studies here, working on a exciting project on data transparency. So Rebecca.
Thanks very much. I'm really glad when I saw that Chris Wilson was going to be here, that I chose to go after him, because I hope to be a bit of a supplement to a lot of what you talked about, and the overlap between different communities and commonalities. And my work over really the past 10 years has spanned across academia, activism, and journalism. And it's been very, very interesting to watch the evolution of people encountering digital security threats of different kinds, figuring out how to deal with them, the points at which people realize these are problems that affect them and their community for the first time. And of course, activists and journalists tend to be much more direct targets for surveillance than academic researchers. They're sort of the obvious low-hanging fruit. If you're a government looking for people, to target as sort of the nexus for your traffic analysis and figure out who is going to make trouble, keeping very close tabs on journalists and activists is obviously where you want to start. And oftentimes the journalists will lead you to the activists, because that's the nature of things. And I worked in China for 9 years as a journalist, and so and was there when the internet arrived in China, and as journalists began to be aware of issues related to digital surveillance, not just on the computer or via the internet as you're transmitting email, but also on cell phones. And the fact that by the late 90s, we had learned that if you really wanted to have a secure conversation, you leave your cell phone at home or in the office, you go somewhere, maybe ideally for a hike, and you have the conversation that way. And that's pretty much the only way to have a secure conversation. Transaction of information is to do it in a completely analog manner. And then if you're taking notes, of course, keeping this thing secure. Chris talked a lot about kind of throughout the day. Unfortunately, I was a little late getting here, but a lot of different presentations have talked about the various risks and threats. And I thought I would maybe first just talk about some of the categories of risks and threats, and also then point to some tools and guides, just some very specific practical places where you can go for resources for how to be secure and how to determine what your threats are. And what's interesting, and I missed John's presentation, but I take it you were talking mainly about, kind of the authoritarian bad guy regimes, and of course researchers working in those types of regimes have been aware of risks and threats for a long time. So academics working in China, for instance, which is one of the countries I know best, have had to encounter these issues and have been acutely aware of them for a long time. And I guess these threats fall into perhaps 5 categories, which are really the same categories that activists and journalists face. It's both kind of general tracking and targeted tracking. You have network analysis, and there was a lot of discussion earlier today about network analysis, who's in your social network, who you're communicating with, combined with traffic analysis. So kind of who you're calling on your phone and where you're going, and looking at those patterns and who's connected to whom, and that might lead an adversary, in many cases the government, to a researcher who the government hadn't been looking at before, but that researcher happens to be friends with some journalists and happens to know some activists, and they're kind of in this cluster over here, and suddenly they become of interest. And then, of course, the academic would be targeted, more likely to be targeted for content surveillance, that there would be attention paid to, where are they connecting to the internet from? And can we capture their emails if their emails are not going through an encrypted connection, and see who they're communicating with? And, given that our traffic analysis indicated this person is involved with communities that we're interested in, kind of where does that lead us? And so that's kind of content surveillance, starting to pay more attention to that person's actual phone calls, that person's actual text messages, that would be, it's just a matter of letting the phone company know and the ISP know that, we want special attention paid to this particular individual, and that goes into a special queue that's not just kind of the general population, right? And so then, if the individual's communications not sufficiently secured are deemed to be of sufficient interest, then the adversary can go a few steps further. One is physically accessing the researcher's laptop. If the researcher doesn't have the laptop with them 24/7, then it can be accessed most likely, and unless they're encrypting their hard drive and are really good at passwords and all that kind of thing. It's very easy to install spyware on that person's computer. It just takes a cleaning lady who's not a cleaning lady at the right point in time, and there you go. The other thing is, of course, phishing and what's known as phishing attacks. I've been on an email list. I think, Guobin, you're probably on it too, of people who follow China, and it's called China Poll, and it's full of China people who study China, kind of a range of journalists and academics and other people. And really, for the past 10 years, there have been all kinds of interesting, sophisticated phishing attacks against people on that email list, who are, of course, going in and out of China, some of whom live in China permanently, and so on, where somebody, an adversary, spoofs the email of one of the members of the list, sticks an attachment on, or sticks a link to a website that's infected with malware, and then because people who are members of that community think it's really coming from a trusted member of the community, click on the link, click on the attachment, they're infected, and so everything that they're transmitting from their computer, every keystroke is CC'd to the Public Security Bureau. So if that individual has gotten to that level of interest, then that's another way of collecting information from a community of interest. And then there's, of course, hacking into people's various accounts. Hacking into if you've got spyware on someone's computer, you can sort out what their passwords are pretty easily. You can hack into their Facebook account, their Gmail account, and so on. So that's another way at getting at the researchers' network and getting at their communications. And so that's sort of the levels of threats. And obviously, people working in certain types of authoritarian countries have been dealing with these issues for a while. But I've been having growing numbers of conversations with academics who study, undocumented immigrants in the United States, or other communities who might be vulnerable to certain types of surveillance, who are starting to realize, wow, we really need to actually worry about these things in a much broader set of research communities than we had thought. And other communities like lawyers, for instance, are starting to realize, wow, we need to boost our digital hygiene pretty fast, kind of recognizing the lack of security. And so, this is becoming a universal problem, and it's, of course, not just you have the researcher, you have their subjects, obviously, and we've talked quite a bit today about the relationship between the researcher and the subjects, and concerns about putting subjects at risk, obviously, if all of these things I just described happen to you, your subjects are at a non-trivial level of risk. But there are also some other kind of aspects to keep in mind as well, which I've just kind of observed in the course of being involved with various research projects and so on. One has to do with if you have research assistants and students who are from particular countries and they're helping you with research about particular countries, has sufficient consideration been given to the risks they and people not involved, and people who are not subjects, but people who are close to them for other reasons might be put at, and how to mitigate those risks. So also research partners. There are a lot of research projects where one institution gets a grant and then re-grants pieces of research to partners in different parts of the world. And is there sufficient attention being paid to the security of communications with those partners? Is there kind of an assessment of what the threat is and what needs to be mitigated in those situations, and how is that all being looked at and considered? So what I wanted to do is just point to a few very practical resources that are developed primarily for journalists and activists, but I think really, given that I haven't seen any research any such resources developed specifically for academic researchers, I think this is a good place to start. And in fact, to come back to this China poll community, you know, when academics are saying, oh, what do I do? How do I secure my communications? I have always tended to send them to these types of websites. But this website here is Security in a Box. It's put out by an organization called the Tactical Technology Collective in conjunction with another organization called Frontline Defenders. I've met a number of people, I know a number of people who work for them, but they have a set in multiple languages, right? So if you actually go, I'll just click on this. If you go to their front page, you'll see, let me see here. If I go to the non-English, they actually have this in multiple languages. So it can be of use for research partners or even people you're kind of talking to, again, depending on what your research is, but a very thorough set of how-tos on how to protect your information from different types of threats, a whole review, a guide to using specific types of tools, and also links to download these tools. So a very practical guide, and again, available in lots of different languages, plus a lot of resources and kind of continuing analysis as new information comes to light in all sorts of different contexts. Another guide is from something called Floss Manuals, which is sort of the open source community that makes manuals on basic internet security, which is also, I think, a little bit more advanced, but nonetheless, again, sort of depends on what we call your threat model is. Speaking of threat modeling, if you want to be 100% secure from all possible threats, the amount of technology you have to use and the amount of time you have to spend learning that technology is really high, and you may never actually get your research done, or it would certainly, there's always this trade-off, right? And so there's, in this kind of security and activist community now, there's a lot of talk of what's called threat modeling, that you need to kind of assess your threat, figure out who your adversaries are, what your vulnerable assets are, information assets are, what your vulnerable communications are, what your vulnerable interlocutors are, and basically assess, and based on that assessment, decide what you need to do. So the Surveillance Self-Defense Project that has been published by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and it's just ssd.eff.org, they have a resource here, this link from their front page on risk management. And so how to think about the various trade-offs you're making. Because there's always trade-offs between convenience, ease of use, time, and security. So figuring out what are the assets you need to protect. I won't click through all the links. What are the threats? Who are your adversaries? What are you trying to protect against? What is the worst case scenario? What is likely to be the greatest risk? And then how to determine, again, this whole question that was discussed earlier, do you talk to your subjects on Facebook, or do you want to use OTR, which is a secure chat client? Just to what extent you need to make these choices and trade-offs. To have a basic way of dealing with that. The CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has what's called a Journalist Security Guide, which, at first blush might not seem to be relevant to academic researchers, but actually there's quite a bit that's useful in this guide, particularly when it comes to questions about thinking about threats and trade-offs. So I think that section in the guide on understanding the threat, assessing the threat, They recommend making a list of potentially valuable data, making a list of people who are potentially vulnerable in what way, and then making some decisions about what you need to do and what others working with you need to do. And there's also another project. I mean, the threat modeling thing can get very complicated. And there are organizations, and it sounds like you guys are also sort of working on a more sophisticated threat modeling tool based on what you said. There's one other, I hadn't put this in. Let's see if I'm not typing it right. Yeah. So there's one organization or sort of group of developers who are working on a threat modeling tool. And at the moment, the tool is under development, but they have a spreadsheet, and you can basically download the spreadsheet, and then it has all these different vectors that you might want to think about, which may seem a little bit complicated for a lot of research, but if you're doing some pretty complex research, also involving programming, tool development, and so on, it might be worth trying to get more down in the weeds on thinking about the various factors at play and how they interact with one another. So I just thought that, I'm not quite sure how much time I've used. I've probably used most of it. Yeah, so I can cede my 2 minutes to the Q&A. I thought it would be useful, given the kind of general discussion that we've been having, to just point to some very specific resources and suggest ways in which some of these resources might be integrated into IRB processes. For instance, should an IRB require a threat modeling, digital threat modeling process for certain types of projects? What would that look like? Should there be consideration about the researchers you're working with and the threats to them? Some questions like that. What do graduate students need to be taught about all this early on? Is graduate school too late? Should undergraduates be taught about some of this stuff? Should high school students be taught about, just to what extent does all of these concepts, just as people start learning how to do research and writing and analysis at a very young age, do concepts of risk management, digital risk management, need to be introduced very early on in the educational process? And how does one do that? I mean, certainly there's a lot of soul searching right now in the journalistic community about, journalism education absolutely must teach this stuff, and it's absolutely, completely criminally irresponsible not to be teaching this stuff. To what that's sort of a growing consensus among a lot of people. To what extent the academy has the responsibility to teach more of these concepts early and often, I think is really worth debating. I imagine I've used up my 2 minutes by now anyway, so I will no longer cede it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we have about half an hour for discussions and Q&A. And if I may, I'm going to start with a question for our entire panel. And the question was sort of inspired by Rebecca's sort of passing mention of this idea of digital hygiene, which I thought is really fascinating and interesting. And my question is it possible to sort of keep this kind of digital hygiene when the entire ecology has been polluted or is increasingly being polluted? And this is, I suppose, is a big question. And sort of in a way, I thought we are on our way, moving toward a kind of a new form of totalitarianism, which we might call informational totalitarianism. And are there possible safe havens in this new world? And you again, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, you want to have a safe conversation, leave your cell phone in your room, go on a hike. Are those the options that are left with us, or are there other kind of options? Any kind of responses from you?
Should we go down the line? Would you like to go first?
That's what I get for sitting here.
Or do we only have to rely on technological solutions or other solutions?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah, go first.
Yeah, I think that, we talk a lot about digital hygiene in these circles, and it's a really useful metaphor because it really is about practice and habit more than it is about tools. It's not so much which soap you use, it's about how you consider your environment. How important is it to you to bathe once a day? It's not equally important for everybody, but it's about understanding the context in which you operate and understanding the consequences of different actions. And it is essentially about coming to grips with the fact that we do live in an information ecology, not just an information environment. And that's actually quite complex, and it's quite difficult to build up the capacity to do threat models without having to sit down and expend a tremendous amount of energy. That's part of the challenge here, I think, is coming up with quick and easy tools. But then even if we can do that, the second part of the challenge, which we have learned from the digital security field over the last 10 years, is creating habits that last, creating hygienic habits that last, because inevitably it will get in the way and it will slow down the work we're trying to do, whether it's in the same crippling way that an IRB can slow down a research project or whether it just adds extra steps. Of course, varies with context too.
Yeah. Do we have to just go completely offline in order to be totally secure? I mean, that's where it's going. It already is that way in a lot of cases, and if you really want to be sure that that your conversation is not going to be captured anywhere on Earth, then that is the case. I mean, the likelihood of the surveillance being sort of active kind of varies depending on what jurisdiction you might be in for that conversation, and so, yeah. But it's a real problem. I think what Chris said about habits is absolutely critical. And, by the time a person is in grad school, it's way too late to form habits, which is why I increasingly feel that these habits need to be inculcated very early on, need to be really baked into the educational system. I mean, a lot of digital literacy is not currently in the educational system and needs to be, and this is yet another component that I think is really important. But along with, this whole question of, is this what the world has come to, that you can't have a secure conversation unless it's a completely analog conversation? The only way to prevent that from happening is if all of us refuse to allow that to be the case, So, I mean, it's a much larger issue of saying, what's going, just in terms of holding governments to account, holding companies that are running these services and platforms to account, and making sure that, okay, we recognize there's legitimate surveillance purposes. If you start from the view, which not everybody shares, that there are some legitimate law enforcement and national security purposes for surveillance. How do you constrain them? How do you hold them accountable? And how do we make sure we have a digital environment in which power is held to account? And until we get a little further on to being able to answer that question, at least in democracies, we are heading well, we're basically already in that world of the only secure conversation is taking a hike in the park with your cell phone very far away and no other individuals anywhere nearby who might have a parabolic microphone.
I'm glad I waited a few minutes so I could kind of jump off of both of your comments, because really, I agree wholeheartedly, and I also think that it's something that we need to have a conversation and have a different, maybe not different, a new way of thinking about ethics in this kind of a situation, a new way of thinking about communication, what we consider privacy. I think it was Randy who talked about the party line, right? And you said, your story was you picked up the phone, somebody said, oh, I'm on the other line, I'll be off in 10 minutes. And you said, and I hung up, okay? Do we have that sense of, oh, I should hang up? Do we have policies that make it that there are times when it's not okay to listen? And I think that that's something that we're very far away from right now at a political level and at a policy level. And it's concerning. And I think that one of the ways to make that happen is to teach this kind of hygiene, or whatever you want to call it, the importance of security very early on.
So, questions?
Yeah, so the question I have, this one should questions, maybe the panelists could talk more about this. So if you have, say, a ton of traffic that's going over a pipe, and all the traffic's unencrypted, right? So you can listen to all of it. Now, on each side of that big pipe, let's say two friends figure out, oh, we should start encrypting our stuff. Well, if I'm the guy listening on the pipe, it's going to be pretty obvious that those are two people I'm going to want to pay like a lot of attention to. So I do agree, like I advocate for security tools too. I'd like if you guys could talk a little bit more about how one takes on additional risk even by using security tools when so few people do, and how you can get enough people using it so it's not just two people in the pipe.
Just to add to that, this was the story that that NSA actually put something in the Tor a while ago that to listening to is dropping your communication, which you assume are secure.
Although they weren't very successful. I mean, they could capture some stuff going across Tor nodes that they had set up themselves, but they weren't actually able to crack the Tor technology. Just wanted to clarify that for my friends at Tor. But yeah, I mean, this issue is a big one, Tim, that you raise. And I mean, again, coming back to my experience in China, which is my deepest experience, there are a lot of both, Chinese investigative journalists as well as activists as well as lawyers in China who don't use Tor or PGP because it's like, putting up a big target, and so take this calculated risk and also take the risk that it's so hard to be secure that they just sort of give up even trying, and that their approach is, well, I'm exercising my constitutional rights, and so anybody who goes after me is, I don't believe I'm breaking the law, and so therefore I'm not going to act like I am, and if they're going to come after me, I'll just, that's my calculated risk to then be kind of a martyr in the whole situation. So there's a lot of people who kind of take that perspective, which is, again, they're making decisions about what risks to take on what end, but it's hard. I mean, this is why there's a lot of people who advocate that everybody should use Tor no matter what they're doing, so that it won't be so obvious. It's hard to get critical masses of people to use Tor for lots of technical reasons. This is why some of the security engineers say we just need to build much more security into everything and need to build encryption into everything, so that just normal email and normal instant messaging and normal social networking, will all be secure, and so nobody can, it won't raise a red flag because everybody's doing it. The problem is that given that creating nonprofit
tools is, always results in things that aren't as easy to use as Facebook and Gmail, that you have to get the companies to actually agree to do this. And that's proving not as compatible with their business model as they are interested in. So, yeah, it's a tough issue, and, some security people are saying, well, we need to kind of just change the protocols of the internet to just make everything more, just force it. But that's a much longer running project.
Follow up on that. I think that would be the security community's responses. That's why everybody should be using encrypted communication, cover it with noise. But to my mind, it's hard to imagine many circumstances in which that would work for academic research, because there tends to be a direct correlation between, the kind of harm that might result and how closely the people that you're communicating with in country will be watched. And so again, it always comes back to a contextual analysis and having some kind of tools at your disposal to understand what the risks are and how to mitigate them. But I would imagine that for this community, the more useful tools would probably have to do with data storage. And keeping the data that you do have safe, and there's a lot of other tricks to kind of disguise your data as something else. So there's.
I just want to come back to this paradox of, the cleanliness and the hygiene on the one hand, on the other hand, the great journalistic traditions of muckraking and getting the dirt. I mean, there's a strange kind of paradox here that on the one hand, we clean as a whistle, but then, what happens when the whistleblower has got to eventually, in other words, what happens when the publication comes? And, because then surely, you've got to have people who are willing to go on the record, or you've got to have sources. So I think the journalistic paradoxes are rather more complex than maybe we're admitting. I mean, and I think it's interesting, China's this big, red, scary devil over there, and it's the other. But, a lot of situations aren't quite like that. And I think, so up to the point of publication, maybe all the hygiene's all very good, but then what happens? And I think...
Thanks for all your comments. They were great. I just had a couple of things to say in terms of IRBs and data security policies. A couple of boards, Harvard and North Carolina's boards, have started tiered systems. So basically, a protocol gets ranked according to its risk level, and at the highest level would be data that's air-gapped. So again, we are moving back to that very isolated model, and we're moving away from the interconnectedness model, I think, in terms of security policies. And then in the U.S. right now, where the Office for Human Research Protections put out something called the ANPRM a few years back, and that's basically could implement a change in our human subjects protections plans. And and in the ANPRM, data security was a very specific piece. It got a lot of pushback from behavioral social scientists because it would raise the level of scrutiny around social behavioral data and apply more HIPAA medical type data standards to much data. So I think that's something important to watch. And then I had a specific question, though, for Chris. I've read recently, in the recent past, about initiatives around the right to disappear, or the right to be erased, and Rebecca as well. The right. Can you comment on those? And so it's coming from an EU model of we have this right to disappear, and how do you respond to that? Thank you.
Okay, so we have two sets of questions.
So Chris, would you like to start, or Rebecca now has responses to the first question?
Yeah, that's a tough nut to crack. The right to anonymity. I mean, it's kind of a very natural reaction to the tremendous amount of information that we're faced with now. I'm not sure where to put it on a normative landscape, but I would argue that for this context, it's a really important aspect of consent and, privacy by design of research projects, et cetera. Yeah, I don't know if I have much more to comment on aside from that.
Yeah, I think she was asking less about anonymity than kind of pending sort of proposed legislation in Europe, the right to be forgotten, so that you would have, for instance, the right to tell Facebook to erase stuff that you had posted when you were 15 that you are now, trying to get off the internet. But it could also potentially be used, let's say, by politicians to censor things that people had photographed them doing that were unethical, say. And so there's a lot of controversy about exactly, there are some legitimate concerns, particularly around minors, particularly around certain types of privacy issues, but there's some serious free speech issues that, of course, affect academic researchers, and particularly academic researchers who are kind of going back and looking at archived online content or historical online content, and if people have kind of gone and cleaned it up after having, I don't know, had a change of heart about different things, that has interesting implications. I guess the legislation in Europe is still being debated. It's likely that there will be some form of it, but folks on the free speech side have been pretty adamant that, let us not let this be used as a way for politicians to sort of whitewash their record. So that'll be interesting to see. On the sort of muckraking publication, yeah, I mean, this is the problem, is that, you're going through, you're taking lots of steps to be very secure, and then the article comes out, and then the, whoever is being slammed, muckraked in the article is going to try and figure out who you spoke to and go after them. And this is, of course, part of why, ironically, the Committee to Protect Journalists just came out with a report today about how the Obama administration is the worst since the Nixon era in terms of going after journalist sources and whistleblowers. And, that is a post-publication thing where the shoe comes down. And so this, of course, relates to how you identify your sources, issues of can you be compelled to reveal your sources. There are lots of shield laws in at least some countries, or efforts at shield laws on journalists and having the right to protect their sources, but particularly in the digital age is, SSRN papers get passed around on Twitter, and, somebody's very academic paper, which nonetheless has some things that are deeply of public interest, suddenly kind of becomes mass media-ified, will an adversary start going after the people that researcher spoke to? And, in that case, is that researcher going to be protected by shield laws that are meant to protect journalists? And, that's kind of a whole new territory of really tough questions. And of course, as a journalist, I certainly, and I think a lot of journalists, I think Katie was talking about sort of you're a human being first and you're an academic researcher second kind of thing, and that's certainly, you have to think about, okay, is this story worth the risk to the subject, and does the subject understand the risk, and am I doing everything I can to obscure their identity if it's the kind of thing where that is really called for, and your responsibility, and I think I think you mentioned this earlier. There are times when you just have to decide not to publish. There are some stories that are worth it no matter what, and your sources care about it so much they don't care if they go to jail. And there are some stories that are just not worth ruining somebody's life over. And, the extent to which, or even risking ruining somebody's life over, and the extent to which researchers are confronted with that question and have to grapple with it. I think now that academic research kind of can easily be catapulted out of journals and into the public limelight in a much faster way than ever before, I think that question maybe something that needs to get paid more attention to. But
Can I follow up just actually understood that first question? No. Thanks. Yeah, so I think in that sense, the right to be forgotten from specific databases, I think that raises at least two really important conversations that merit a much closer look within this context. There is the function creep. How do power and informational contexts change over time? How can we anticipate that, especially when we're working in countries that have dynamic political contexts? That requires a tremendous, perhaps impossible amount of foresight. And then the mosaic effect. To what extent can identifiable, can anonymized research data be mixed with other data sets to identify people? And this also harkens back to your difference between regulation and ethics, I think, because in the public sphere, with the EU regulation, I think that the argument against it for the sake of public figures is a little bit different in this context, because what we are talking about in a research context is perhaps more dealing with data subjects who have voluntarily supplied information, or perhaps secondary subjects or people within an information ecology who are not public figures in the same way. And I think this is something that's going to be increasingly a topic of conversation in these circles, and just want to note that the Oxford Internet Institute is coming out with guidelines next week, I think, on privacy and research on mobile networks. And one of the best practices that they're recommending for informational self-determination is a dashboard for research projects that subjects can access with user accounts to see how their data is being used, how the research is being applied, and where they have the opportunity, if situational contexts change, to retract their data and to be excluded from the database. I'm really curious to see what kind of traction that gets in the community, if it's feasible or interesting to the Academy at all, but it's at least on the table.
I just wanted to add one additional thing to this. I think particularly, I think California is looking to pass a similar kind of right to be forgotten legislation, and I'm not sure what point it's at in legislation. But I also think, and this is probably a very U.S.-centric issue, it's also a matter about what is considered wrong, you know, and this is going to change. Your mention of whether it's a public figure or we have certain levels, but a lot of times we maybe not so much in actual academic research, but we certainly get information that really is uninteresting except for the fact that it might be titillating, you know, and so yeah, can that be forgotten at some point? Is that just, you know, not something that should follow an individual around for the rest of their lives? And I think that's just a very kind of pedestrian aspect of this that we also need to think about.
And not to mention with all the different types of data collection that are going, I mean, elementary schools right now are collecting a tremendous amount of data. So in 20 years, does the fact that your kid was documented eating dirt, how is that going to impact their insurance capabilities and things like that? And then lastly, just to touch, I really appreciated the mixed metaphor of the digital hygiene and muckraking. And to complicate it further, I just suggest that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Recently there was a piece, I think it was an Economist, on that Google streetcars were collecting free Wi-Fi data around the world. And they collected about 800 gigabyte of data, which is communicated over like Starbucks, Wi-Fi, your emails, whatever. And they were saying, oh yeah, it's like public data. And so the court didn't buy that. It's not public data that everyone can. You need this level of sophisticated knowledge to capture that. And deeper to that is that there's a business model out there. And it says that, oh, you sell your freedom or your data for free service. Is it a new, better we should think, because, you know, Facebook is there, said, oh, you have to, you know, pay and define the profit for IPO and whatever. So we need to sell your data to third parties. So should we come up with a new business model that does not need to sell your data for free service? Google said that, oh yeah, we do mining on your data, no human being going to look at your emails. But I remember when I was even writing in Pinglish, I mean, that's writing Farsi with English characters, it gave me like, oh, do you want to get a TOEFL test? So it noticed that and say, oh, this is in Tehran, and blah, blah, blah. So it knows that, and yes, it scares people because they don't want people go look at the data. The algorithms look at the data, stand you out. So do you think that there might be thinking about a new business model that does not work on this type of free data for free service for selling your data?
One point about the Google Street View is that that was not the users giving up their data for a free service. It was Google conducting surveillance on people who might not even have been Google users, you know, and just picking up their open Wi-Fi signals as their car went by and storing that data, which is why a California judge recently agreed that this is a form of wiretapping that they conducted. No, but it was not a free Wi-Fi service. It was that some people had not encrypted, had not password protected their Wi-Fi routers at home, and so therefore the Street View car, as it drove through their neighborhood, was able to pick up whatever they were doing on their network at the time. You know, and so it's like, you know, do you have a right when you're driving through somebody's alley, you know, if your camera's high enough to record everything that's in their backyard and have a database about, you know, there's, at any rate, this has nothing to do with people consenting to give up data for a free service in the Street View case. This was Google actively going and surveilling people. They claim it wasn't intentional. They claim it was for a completely different purpose, blah, blah, blah. But that's a slightly different category of thing, the case that's going on there. To come back to and I just want to clarify that because that's really invasive and aggressive behavior on their part that is beyond just, okay, because I signed up for Facebook and Facebook is free, I'm giving, you know, I'm clicking agree on the terms of service I didn't read and allowing them to collect all this information, which they're going to then monetize and turn into, you know, run ads on the side of my screen, you know, targeting intimate aspects of my preferences and so on. It's a different thing. So I just want to make sure we're all clear about that. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different issues. I mean, in the light of the NSA revelations, the Snowden revelations, there are a number of businesses who are saying, well, actually, we're going to offer a paid service and it's going to be secure, and we're going to try and we're not going to collect your data in this way because we recognize you may not want it stored in a database that would not only be sold to advertisers, but might also go to various government authorities, even if you're not suspected of a crime. And so therefore, we're going to provide this service. So I think we are going to see an expansion of business models around secure products that people are going to be willing to pay for. However, I also do think that it's absolutely imperative that, you know, just as a company will maximize its products if it hires 12-year-olds and pollutes our environment to the point we can't live in it, over time, we have made it not in businesses' interest to do that. And the businesses over time have adapted their business model to sustainable products and, you know, their labor practices, you know, they kind of sell that as part of their value. And, you know, there's, you know, a whole kind of social ecosystem around the fact that there are a lot of disincentives for businesses to do certain things that would, in fact, maximize their profits further. But it's so socially unacceptable and, you know, considered, there are so many consequences visited upon them increasingly if they do these things that most businesses choose not to do them, and they find ways to create value and create products that are actually around being responsible. And I think we're in early days on the internet. Businesses, I think, you know, everybody's just been letting these companies do whatever they want and saying, oh, you know, it's capitalism, what can we do? I have nothing to hide, you know. I think we're sort of waking up that life is more complicated than that. And I think we are going to see actually movements to hold businesses more accountable on free expression and privacy. And we're also going to see, I think, increasingly businesses recognizing that their long-term brand value does depend on trust. And trust involves not being completely creepy all the time. And, you know, that I think there's going to be some businesses even that give, you know, paid service, I mean, free services or some mix of free and paid that you know, I'm hoping in the long run will, you know, again, sort of move from being completely creepy to being a little bit more like sort of how GE transformed itself over time from being a total nasty polluter to actually having eco-imagination products and actually, you know, having some constraints. Perfect? No, but a lot better than they used to be 50 years ago? Absolutely, yes. And so I'm hoping that we will see that with internet and telecommunications companies, but it's going to take a lot, it's going to take as much work on everybody's part as it took from the labor and environmental movements, so let's get to work.
So it's just about time, but final remarks, Chris? Yeah.
Really quick, but I'd actually like to kind of turn it back to the room. I think that's an opportunity. Sure, can I just pose a question and then we'll turn around and talk about it after the break? So maybe even during the break? To cherry pick your comment, I think you're absolutely right that
My rant.
it might be more likely that than new business models in the medium term, we see market segmentation and new ways to extract value from norms like privacy. But I'm curious to see what that grander vision looks like when applied to the research context. I think that there's something, you know, almost obviously disingenuous about the assertion that Google is a free service in exchange for data, because I think the number is that they sell the average individual's data for about $500 a year. And so in a sense, that is $500 that is being paid for your data. It's not free. But that disingenuous proposal is not that different, I think, than what Katie was talking about earlier, in the option to just slide over a discussion completely about what you're going to do with your research when you're talking with somebody in country. You know, you don't want to discuss the fact that it's getting you tenure, but also avoiding the issues of how that information is used and how it relates to the people in country. And my question to the room would be, it seems to me that the argument is that in the long term, that's not sustainable, because in the long term, what you want to do is develop relationships with the people you're researching in country. And in order to do that well and to be able to keep coming back to them, you need to have some kind of full disclosure about where the data is going. And my question to the room is whether or not that is a controversial statement in the academy. Do you think that researchers are... Is this an obvious argument for them? Is this something that people are on board with? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, thank you all. And we'll have our coffee break and come back for more discussions.